Well, welcome everybody to our session where we're going to talk about the impact of racial campus climate on advancing equity in CTE. I'm Marcy Rocky, the Assistant Director for Community College Relations and Research at OCCRL, and I'll let my colleague Colvin just briefly introduce himself before we get started.
Hi everyone, my name is Colvin Georges and I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Illinois and also a research assistant in the Office of Community College Research and Leadership.
Thanks, Colvin. And of course, we're under the leadership of Dr. Ebenezer Gallagher, who you may have heard from earlier this morning during our 8 a.m. session. And so again, you may be familiar with us. And that, of course, you may have seen me earlier this morning in presentations, but just in case you're not as familiar with OCCRL, we are located at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We have a long-standing relationship with the Illinois Community College Board and appreciate all their support of the work that we do, particularly with CTE in Illinois. But we also have projects outside of Illinois. And so all of the projects that we do really look at how we advance policies, programs, practices to enhance outcomes for diverse youth and adults through college to employment. And so you can see here that we look at this, comprehensive P20 educational pathways, which of course are very relevant and critical to CTE, public engagement, transformative leadership, equity-driven change, and we are very specific and intentional about how we center equity and particularly racial equity in the work that we do. So that's a little bit about our office. And so as we go through this session, just want to give you an outline of what to expect. We're going to be talking about, what is racial campus climate? So how do we define what that is and operationalize it and understand it? We're going to look at race and educational equity, particularly in the state of Illinois. And then we're also going to look at the CTE racial context. So both looking at Illinois, but also, nationally. And then talking about the racial campus climate and how it relates to CTE equity. And then we'll share some resources and offer some time for questions. And throughout our presentation, we will have some discussion questions. So again, please feel free to unmute or use the chat box to engage in those discussions. And so I will turn it over to Colvin, who's going to get us started in understanding racial campus climate.
Thanks so much, Marcy. To begin today's conversation on the impact of racial campus climate on advancing equity in CTE, we provide a shared definition of racial campus climate. According to Rankin and Reason, racial campus climate is the current attitudes, behaviors, and standards of employees and students of an institution. Dr. Marcy Rocky expanded on this definition, stating that it describes the ways in which racial identity impacts student experiences in a specific campus environment. Now, as we further unpack this concept of racial campus climate, I want us to take a moment to pause and reflect on some of the issues currently affecting our nation. Depending on our cultural backgrounds, social identities, and lived experiences, some of us may automatically think about COVID-19 or issues related to climate change, the economy, or healthcare. Others might reflect on the racialized injustices affecting Black and Brown people, particularly related to gendered racism and police brutality, etc. Some of us may dwell on these issues simultaneously because we are directly impacted by them due to our multiple minoritized social identities. Our identities do not afford us with the privilege of being able to opt out and not think about these societal issues when we think about it in the context of the multiple minoritized social identities. As we further explore racial campus climate, the reality is that racially minoritized communities are negatively impacted by these social, economic, and political issues and more. The unfortunate truth of this is that while our college campuses are intended to be safe, diverse, and free of harm, they mirror the same adversities as experienced within the larger society, and racially minoritized students are at a greater risk of not completing due to hostile campus climates. Higher education is a microcosm of the American society, and as we think about racial campus climate, we must recognize and accept the truth that racism and other forms of oppression are still present, and they affect our students daily. The scars of racism have never healed and is deeply ingrained in our institutions, particularly on college campuses. When exploring racial campus climate in this context, we can quickly see the racial equity gaps on Illinois community college campuses through racial and ethnic disparities in completion rates, participation in CTE programs, implicit and explicit biases, hate speech, and structural and systemic barriers negatively affecting racially minoritized groups. Hence the reason we see an uptick in student unrest, college campuses remain hostile, and our racially minoritized students are forced to confront these challenges while trying to persist academically and earn gainful employment in a society that does not value them. Next slide. In this next segment of our presentation, we believe that it is important to highlight overall equity gaps in educational attainment and contextualize how racial campus climate plays a role specifically in Illinois. The data shown in front of you was gathered from the Illinois Board of Higher Education, focusing specifically on adult populations 25 and older. Here we see that the white population has more levels of education than other groups when disaggregated by race. More specifically, 32.4% of white people 25 and older attained a high school diploma, GED, or less, compared to 42.4% of African Americans, 64.1% Latinx, 20.2% Asian, and 27.1% of other populations. We infer that with the largest population of African Americans and Latinx communities earning no higher than a high school diploma and or GED or less, they make up the most low-wage, low-skill jobs. We will explore this a little further in the preceding slides. Other factors that we can identify from this data is that of the entire Illinois population, 28.3% of African Americans 25 and older attended some college but did not earn a degree. 8% earned an associate's degree, and 21.4% earned a bachelor's degree or higher. We would like to highlight a key factor related to racial inequity in the workforce. Since this data comes directly from the Illinois Strategic Plan, the populations that experience the most inequities are African Americans, Latinx, low income, and working adults. In these racial groups, large populations are working adults 25 and older and are not engaged in higher education and never have. Case in point, let's revisit the Latinx population with only 61.4% earning a high school diploma, GED or less. And the figures are less and less when looking at the other areas of educational attainment within this group. We encourage Illinois educators and policymakers to critically explore and identify structural barriers to post-secondary education for racially minoritized communities. Examine factors related to costs, issues of oppression, immigration policies, family obligations, and levels of external support. Moreover, we ask Illinois educators and policymakers to assess Illinois campus climates. Are these environments welcoming? Are faculty incorporating culturally responsive practices within their curriculum design? Are faculty and staff considering the biases that employers hold against racially minoritized communities, which then affect their ability to earn or get hired in these high-wage jobs? How can Illinois community college faculty and administrators work together to dismantle these barriers affecting the lives of racially minoritized communities and workforce outcomes across the state? To this end, we believe that it is critical for the state of Illinois to connect with these populations, with these adult populations, particularly those from racially minoritized groups, and help them to attain academic degrees or credentials to advance educational attainment and social mobility across the state. By doing this, we believe that it could address and close existing racial equity gaps and disparities in the workforce. Next slide. This data is from the National Association for Partnerships and Equity. They prepare an equity report by state. Here we see an overall picture of who is participating in CTE programs between high school and college. As shown, we can see that CTE enrollment is overwhelmingly white between secondary and post-secondary education. As many of you might know, K-12 demographics are shifting where over half of students enrolled in school districts identify as a racially minoritized person. So when thinking about your campus climate in terms of your own institution's ability to serve an increasingly racially diverse population, it is important to recognize who is represented in CTE programs relative to racial identities between these two levels. Next slide. Now we will take a deeper dive into the national data relative to workforce industries. Please keep in mind that this information is not Illinois specific and focuses on the United States at large. Nationally, we see that white students are the majority across CTE areas. Highest compensated fields are trades and engineering, architecture, and the least compensated field is consumer services. We can see that the white community is the most represented in the higher paid fields, whereas racially minoritized folks are most represented in consumer services fields, which are lower wage jobs. Historically, when we think about these areas of CTE, for example, who has had access versus who has not, the trades in particular have always been white men. That being said, we implore community colleges to take a deeper dive and analysis into the national data to recognize that these programs are racialized and equity gaps do exist, and use this data as a way to improve access and participation for historically excluded groups. If not, these disparities and racial equity gaps may continue to widen, causing more divide between races. Next slide.
Thanks, Colvin. So as Colvin, kind of looked into the context of this by, within our state and then nationally, one of the things that we want to engage in discussion about is this kind of deeper dive into your own context. So again, as Colvin mentioned, our community colleges are microcosms of everything else that's going on in these bigger systems around us. So when we think about, in particular, our Perkins plan for the state of Illinois and how we're centering equity, and our institutions are being asked to disaggregate data, identify equity gaps, and then identify action steps towards continuous improvement that close those gaps. And so ICCB and ISBE have really, stated within our Perkins plan that, you need to engage in further research to contextualize and clarify the root causes to be targeted for intervention. And so when we think about those root causes, right, as to why we see in particular these racial equity gaps within our local, state, and national context, we want to engage in some discussion to ask you all to share or discuss, where do you see stratification that furthers racial equity gaps in educational attainment and income? And so even within CTE programs or, overall pathways, right? So health professions or agriculture, natural resources. So when we think about digging deeper into this data, it's not just, right, that students are completing a credential, but who's completing what credential, right? What is the outcome of that when we think about employment and earnings? Where do we see racially minoritized students being concentrated? And what are we doing to advance opportunities into higher wages? And to talk about and name that stratification. So we just want to open up discussion here again in the chat. You can unmute yourself, but where do you see stratification that furthers racial equity gaps when you think about educational attainment and income? Any thoughts?
Marcy and Colvin, we did have one comment come through from Teresa. Do you think that programs like TRIO, which promote and measure PSE enrollment and completions, emphasize transfer degree programs over CTE programs? What specific actions can we take to increase equitable enrollments in CTE programs?
Yes, thank you for that question. And so we do recognize with particularly programs like TRIO, right, that you have maybe programs that are funded or guided or restricted to certain areas of transfer or CTE. And so, I think with these, and again, I invite anybody to share action steps that they've taken to increase equitable enrollments in CTE programs. And one of the things that we have to remember and reckon with is the historical context of CTE, right? That there have been, much of what we see is that there have been, the systems have been created, right, to put racially minoritized students into low-wage CTE programs. So when you think about building trust, or even, exclusion, right? What's the history of the trades, right? We know the history of the trades in terms of being exclusionary by race, by gender, that creates a broader culture. So part of this, when we think about TRIO, which may be looking at transfer degree programs, right, is, connecting this whole bigger picture into whether we're talking about transfer CTE, who's completing what and what's the outcome? What do the earnings look like? And I think with CTE in particular, aligning with the labor market, which is shifting a lot, right? Especially post-pandemic, and thinking about what are the high wage, high demand programs, and how are we intentional about identifying opportunity gaps or engaging with communities that may never have been engaged before, and thinking about that. Heather says some institutions may have had success through WEI grant programs. So I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but I guess I'm thinking kind of holistically, and even how we can break down silos, because we also know, right, that particularly with occupations or programs that historically might have required a high school diploma, or may not have needed a bachelor's degree, that those things, how we think about transfer and CTE also has to shift, right? Because there's also many career pathways within CTE that actually do matriculate into bachelor's degrees. And so I know that we have our way of the way that we define or organize things on our campuses, but I think we kind of have to break down those silos, and also ask those bigger questions about, how do we, when we think about income inequality and inequity, what are we doing with all of these tools that we have to close that gap and ensure that people are completing credentials that lead to higher wages that actually close racial wealth gaps, racial income gaps. So I don't know, Colvin, if you want to add anything to that, or if anyone else has anything to share. And I'm curious, even, within TRIO, I'm not sure if people see gaps, or how you feel like even the racial campus climate influences the TRIO program, TRIO students.
Marcy, this is Heather. You really made me think with your response to my comment about, sure, we have the Workforce Equity Initiative grant funds to help students, specifically Black students, enter high wage careers. But then I haven't really even considered how, we tried to choose high demand careers, but I never looked at it through the equity lens about what careers did we really choose? And are we really addressing the issue given all the opportunities that could be available? So I appreciated your comment there.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think, as and Colvin was sharing that data right on populations 25 and over, and I think sometimes we might, again, we have a systems kind of built on this notion, right, of, or even modeled, and again, we're limited by all kinds of regulations, right, with financial aid or but this system that's modeled on a traditional age student coming right out of high school. And we know that that is not who the student is, right, increasingly. Like, we worked with a community college recently where it's like 75% of their students attend part-time, right? So if we have pathways that are built on a full-time assumption, or, where we have to really think about, again, the root causes of why things aren't working, or exclusionary practices and how that influences the culture, not only of our college and the program, but the employers, right? So, what happens when students are going into to local employers, and what is the culture like there? But yeah, thinking differently, right, about these on and off ramps, or, how do we help people get into higher wage jobs and then continue getting credentials within that pathway while working, right, or balancing family. responsibilities.
So Marcy, Teresa added another comment in there. She said even nursing, which is a high wage program, encourages students not to work while attending school because it's a demanding program. Who can afford not to work while attending school full time? Sometimes unpaid internships and clinical experiences are not accessible to students.
Exactly. And that's, thank you for that example. And I think that's where we see, right? Nursing in particular, health professions, where we see that stratification, right? And even in, I know at least a Central Illinois sort of hospital system, right? Like looking at their own data and seeing like who's concentrated in lower wage jobs. And what are we doing to create opportunities through partnerships to transition people into higher paying jobs? And it's racialized, right? So first of all, naming that it's racialized. And once you know that, you know, what are you doing with intentionality to think about that? Because there are limitations. And that's where we can think about, you know, if we see which groups are underrepresented, what kind of support is missing? And how can we be intentional about partnering and building that support for those students that are experiencing the inequity? Which kind of brings us, we can move into this next question. We think about, you know, and this isn't a rhetorical question, like we actually want people to talk about this. So why wouldn't a community college want to understand the racialized impact of their policies and practices that contribute to racial equity gaps? Why wouldn't a community college want to understand how racial identity impacts outcomes? Why do people resist or push back?
I think part of it is, you know, if we start to understand, we understand then that we have to make a change, and change is hard, and it's hard to admit that we as an institution have done something that is makes things difficult for our students.
Thanks. Yes, I'm seeing in the chat, Lisa, they think they're already addressing the problem, may not be, and Mark has shared it can mean that they, or an area they're responsible for, help create that practice, right? Yeah, like that recognition of like, we've actually made the problem worse maybe with what we've done, whether that was intentional or unintentional, but we have contributed based on the policies or the way that we do things.
Marcy, to expand on that, sometimes too, I think we have a tendency to focus on what might be more efficient for those of us employed by the college, as opposed to what might be more supportive of our students and our community.
Yes, that's a great point. And also, you know, I think brings up the, you know, again, where we know that our employees, and particularly our faculty, often aren't representative of who our students are, right? So acknowledging the disconnect there, and not, you know, again, naming that, talking about it, understanding why that is and what we can do different. And I think Deja, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, looking at equality over equity, that's a really important point. And we've, and anyone that's been in our presentations, you know how we talk. Okay, thank you. I'm glad I pronounced that correctly. Understanding equality is not the same thing as equity, right? And so again, when we're talking about equity, and particularly with racial equity, are we being specific? Are we naming race, right? Are we, you know, kind of working around it and not naming race, or using sort of a proxy for race when we really need to be talking about race and racial equity. And Lisa says, and employers are not representative. So further problems for CTE programs and their students. Yes. So yes, not having representation across employment context, educational, in terms of who the students are, who the district population is. Yes, and Christina said some schools have districts that have very limited diversity, especially rural districts. So understanding, context and equity in context as well. And also, as you sort of project out with populations, right? Are there shifts, or what does equity look like within your particular district? And Teresa says having to find funding to provide more supports that enable equity. So the funding piece. Which again kind of gets to partnerships. All right, so as we think about this deeper dive, we're going to move into our next slide. And this comes from just part of the transcript of, and if any of you were in the Perkins Administrator pre-conference meeting, we shared the whole video, which we also linked in those slides. But PBS NewsHour did a series called Work Shift, where it's looking at, what does the labor market look like post-pandemic? And also talks a lot, there's a lot of videos that get to these issues of equity by gender and race in particular. And so this quote comes from someone that identifies as a white male in the trades and sharing, there's a certain feeling that it's kind of like a white man's game. I hate to say it. So people who are LGBTQ minorities are a little bit intimidated by the boys club that exists. So he's referring to the skilled trades, where we see, again, nationally, that's overwhelmingly white and male and has historically been that way for reasons that are very intentional, right? And that there's an exclusionary history there that created a culture and systems around it. And so, the NewsHour segment here was looking at, despite the rising salaries. So, when we think about transfer and CTE, that we do have a lot of opportunities, growing opportunities in many regions where CTE programs lead to high wages. And so the skilled labor shortage is getting worse, but also thinking about that in the context of, who has historically been excluded from those opportunities, especially in the trades, and what can we do to change that? And so, this particular video gets to issues of both gender and race ethnicity when we think about this overall culture and the assumptions that we have or that we see when we're engaging with employer groups. And Dr. Sheldon Eakins yesterday in the keynote really touched on a lot of things that Colvin and I are going to talk about as we move forward with racial campus climate. But there's a lot of connections here, right, to what Dr. Eakins was talking about in terms of the racialized climate of our institutions, the extent to which we are engaging in those, culturally relevant practices, or understanding implicit bias and how it affects the way in which our environment is experienced by our students. And again, results in, these stratified programs where we see, again, where we have racially minoritized students often concentrated in lower wage jobs, or having specific barriers to be able to, in the example of nursing, right? In terms of when we think about income inequity, and who actually has the opportunity to go to a nursing program where, you're not going to be able to work a paid job, or you need different supports to be able to get to the same outcome, and the trends that we see within that. And so that kind of brings us to, when we think about these issues, how would understanding your institution's racial campus climate advance equity in CTE programs of study? So how would it be helpful to your institution to understand your racial campus climate and whether or not anybody has experience assessing their racial campus climate? Has anybody engaged in any research or looking into racial campus climate or discussions about doing so?
Rock Valley participated in the race ethnicity pilot survey that SESI put out this year. I haven't had a chance to look at the results to determine how that might help us, but I'm wondering if anyone else has done that and thought of ways to use it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know we heard from some other community colleges before that had some information on the SESI kind of addition to look at racial campus climate. Is anybody else using that? Or planning to? And I know earlier we were talking about, employer partners or industry partners. So, also thinking about where would an understanding of racial campus climate be beneficial to advance racial equity for employer partners? Because again, right, our community colleges are very local and serving our local districts. So we're a microcosm of everything around us. So when we think about the extent to which employer partners or industry partners understand their organization's racial climate. And if you all have experience actually talking about this with any employer partners. Or you're experiencing challenges, maybe talking about this. Is anybody experiencing challenges?
Sorry if I'm dominating, but
No, I appreciate your feedback.
I did have a challenge a few years ago in attending an advisory committee meeting and trying to address the issue by talking about the equity gaps in enrollment and completions within that, leading to careers in that industry. And what I heard from employers was, well, we don't care. We just want qualified employees. And so they kind of put it back, all they want to do is hire people who can do the job, no matter, didn't matter to them who those people were. I don't think that they were saying they didn't want more diversity in their industry, but I think they were kind of putting it on us. Like, if you send us people who are qualified, we'll take them. But they didn't take any responsibility.
Yeah, I appreciate that example where, it's ironic, right? If you're sitting in a meeting and everybody from the industry and the faculty and the administrators might actually be, very homogenous in terms of race, ethnicity, gender. So, because I've been in those meetings too, where it's sort of ironic and people think, well, there can't be anything wrong with like our culture, right? Or like what we're doing. But again, that's kind of thinking about implicit versus explicit, right? So it can be a challenging conversation if it's something that people haven't thought about or had to engage with before, right? Or even recognize like, oh, we're all like really similar. We have similar networks, right? If we think about the trades and the networks, and again, the exclusionary practices, the supports that were racialized, even generationally, when we think about people's on-ramps into the trades. So without recognizing that, and how it affects the overall climate or culture of the organization. Or yeah, like we don't, that internal, like, well, we don't need it. It's not, and even with racial campus climate, right? We have a hesitation to think, well, we might have contributed to this, or, you know, it's about us changing what we're doing, you know, and not, you know, defaulting to kind of this deficit idea of individual students, right? But we know when we look at our systems, these are systemic, historic, ongoing. So we have to do something different. Colvin, do you want to add anything to the discussion before we move forward?
No, I think everything was covered. This was really good.
Thanks. So, you know, feel free to continue thinking. We welcome you to use the chat or contribute to the discussion as we're moving forward. But one of the things we did want to be sure to talk about was that we are actually going to be engaging in a racial campus climate study of our Illinois Community College system. And so ICCB, again, we have an ongoing relationship and we have a variety of projects that we're doing, but one of those projects is going to be a racial campus climate study of the Illinois Community College system. And so ICCB has commissioned our office to conduct a study on diversity, equity, and the racial campus climate in Illinois community colleges. And this is going to gauge faculty, staff, administrator, and student perspectives. So you'll be receiving more information as we are moving forward, you know, with all of our research approvals. And actually we've had this, and we've been wanting to conduct this research for a while, but as with many things, our timeline has been delayed by the pandemic, as we originally were hoping to get this started in the past year, but understood that people were pivoting unexpectedly and have been handling, right, a lot in terms of, you know, asking for support to conduct some more research. And so now we're at a point where we're ready to move forward with this study. And so you'll be getting information on that, and we'll be asking, again, our community college system to help us conduct this research as we are recruiting and getting our plans finalized with our own institutional research board. And along with that, we do have a resource that informed the slides here today in our discussion, kind of a shameless plug for my own brief that I wrote, but it's about assessing racial campus climate. And the idea from this really came from our own conversations and work with community colleges, where we wanted to give people a resource to understand, you know, what is racial campus climate? Why should a community college assess racial campus climate? And then also provide some resources if you were wanting to engage in this work. You know, even if it wasn't your institution, if you wanted to understand the racialized context of a program of study, or, you know, your own department, that this could be a tool that we hope will be helpful, even in maybe getting other people, right, buy-in to understand what this research is and why it's important. And so thank you. I see this is great and exciting. And do you know which listservs ICCB will be using? I don't know. I can connect with ICCB though and get an answer to that, Heather. So hopefully once we get our approvals, this will be widely disseminated, and we're kind of describing that process as we get our own approval from the University of Illinois to do the research in partnership and supported by ICCB. So you can look for more information on that to come, but of course, hoping to have some continued great relationships and partnerships come out of this work that we're doing. So and again, we have some links here to those resources, and I'll transition over to Colvin. and we can facilitate some Q&A if anybody has questions or thoughts. And we welcome your questions or comments related to us moving forward as we're going to be starting this research.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Please be sure to sign up for our listserv to stay up to date with our latest news, network news, research, and more. And in front of you, we are providing a link for you all to sign up to get that information. Next slide. And here's our contact information if you would like to reach out to us for additional support. So now we will open it up for any additional questions that you all have for us regarding today's presentation.
I see a hand raised. Juan Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you. I had there was one slide around kind of like white student participation in CTE programming. And I saw that like from secondary to post-secondary, there was a modest, but still, an increase in white student access to CTE program, and CTE access actually decreased for Latinos and African-Americans, or Black students and Latino students as well. And I reflected on your comment also on like students with in racial inequity groups, at the post-secondary must be struggling to access like full-time programs or kind of degree models. But why is that dynamic not necessarily happening with white students? And I wonder if there's any research on that and why white students are able to increase their CTE enrollment access at the post-secondary level while other groups decrease.
So in terms of, I would say, we think about equity in particular, I think, it's not that they're right that there aren't white students that also can't attend full time, but I think when we center race, we see like disproportionate impact in terms of income inequities, and in terms of, financial resources as it relates to transitioning into post-secondary. And so, and even, I know, I think earlier, we shared the strategic plan for Illinois. And so Colvin and I were talking about this, centers on rural populations, right? So we know disproportionately, even across racial groups, rural students are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And that is more exacerbated if you are a racially minoritized person in a rural area, right? So not that, and that's why we want people to really, we know that these trends exist with racial equity. And so, we want to make sure that we're centering conversations about race, but that doesn't mean that we can't also talk about, right, socioeconomic status or like what does it look like in our region, in our district. And so I guess that's just sort of, as we look at overall research, thinking about who is disproportionately impacted, right? Or even during the pandemic, right? Who was disproportionately impacted by even health, employment, and that we have these growing wealth gaps by race. And so getting down to those root causes. So I guess that's not to say, right, that there aren't, if we look at income, for example, but that we want to encourage people to not just look at income as like a proxy for race, that it's racialized. And also within the program, right, to see where we see people, what are people completing and what are their employment outcomes. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm thinking as I'm talking. I don't know, Colvin, if you have any thoughts. But I also, this data is also, pulling, right? We always know that the data is kind of behind. So again, when we look at this data after the pandemic and even think about students, again, if we look at the racialized context of like who had to stop out, right? Or who who was impacted by shifts to virtual platforms or things like that. So that again, we want people to interrogate their data. So again, it's important to say, we want to look at race. We can also look at gender. We can also look at age. We can also look at socioeconomic status, but also we want to look at the intersection of all those things. Oh, thank you. I see your comment now. I'm glad that helped. And I think too much of, again, the work that we do, we know that, you know, we can, as we support community colleges, even for, you know, Colvin and I having worked in higher ed, you know, previously, where we can be race evasive, right? So we want to help people raise consciousness about thinking about racial equity gaps in particular, and how that intersects with other gaps that we see. Any other questions? Don't see any other questions. I can turn it over to Brittany, who I think is gonna wrap us up and give us some logistical information moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Marcy. And while I'm talking, guys, if you have some questions that pop up, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat as well, and we can answer those because we still have a few minutes here to play with. So Marcy and Colvin, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and some great information. I think that you definitely got some wheels turning and some questions that people are planning to take back to their institutions, and some serious discussions that are going to need to be had at the institutional level. So I thank you for that.